Hi there, I'm Natasha Zouves. Thank you so much for joining us for the Truth of the Matter podcast. Right now, we are unraveling a dark chapter of American history. Pregnant women given radiation to drink to see if it would cross to their unborn babies, told it was just vitamins. And you will meet the lawyer who helped these women go up against a powerful and prestigious university and win. It's finally time to hear these hidden stories. Her name was Helen Hutchinson. She was just 20 years old when she arrived at Vanderbilt University Hospital's prenatal clinic in the summer of 1946. The muggy and oppressive Nashville heat must have weighed heavily on the woman. She's described as being graceful and willowy with wild, long, curly hair. During her pregnancy, relentless nausea and vomiting took 15 pounds from her. Doctors prescribing everything from liver shots to bed rest, but nothing worked. Helen soon landed in a Vanderbilt examination room, a doctor mixing up what he called a cocktail, telling her, quote, "Drink it all, drink it on down." Pulitzer-winning journalist Eileen Wellsome writing this about Helen's experience with the beverage. It was, quote, "fizzy and sweet, like a cherry Coke," end quote. Her name was Emma Kraft. She suspected she may be pregnant when she went to Vanderbilt's prenatal clinic in March of 1946. The details we know about her: she was married to a musician. She was described as being attractive with almost fragile features. At the time she was offered the cocktail, Emma was already confirmed to be pregnant with her fourth child. Her 3 girls had all been delivered by Vanderbilt physicians, and she had the utmost faith in the institutions. Well, years later, Wellsome would transcribe Emma's deposition on what she drank. It reads, quote, "What is it that you were told about the drink?" asked attorney Donald Arbitblit. "It was vitamins," responded Emma. "Did they say anything about whether the drink was good for you or not?" "Yes, they said it was good for me." It was only decades later that the truth would come out. Radioactive iron was inside the cocktails that Emma Kraft, Helen Hutchinson, and around 800 other pregnant women had consumed between September of 1945 and May 30th of 1947. The women had not given consent, and the cocktails were later linked to at least 3 childhood cancer deaths. Originally, the study was intended to explore how a woman's diet and nutrition could impact her pregnancy and delivery, as well as her child's health. However, Wellsome reports Dr. Paul Hahn used his position at the institution to further his own research that asked the question, how much radioactive iron could be absorbed by a woman and her fetus when the woman ingested it? In 1994, Helen Hutchinson and Emma Kraft were plaintiffs in a major lawsuit filed against Vanderbilt. Attorney Donald Arbitblit worked on the case and became very close with Emma, who lost her daughter at just 11 years old to synovial sarcoma that metastasized. He joins us now to talk more about what it was like to be directly involved in this case and to know these women and their stories. Attorney Donald Arbitblit, welcome. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thanks for having me.
Tell me a little bit more about this moment that you found out about this case for the very first time. What did you think when you heard that pregnant women, were given radioactive iron in this country at such a prestigious university? What did you think when you heard this?
It was moving and shocking at the same time. And that's about how I reacted to it. I was very, very shocked that this would have happened. And it took quite a bit of investigation to find out more of the details of how it came to be. They were not told that they'd received radioactive iron. And when the study was published, of course, these are average citizens. They're not scientists reading the medical literature. They had no idea that they had been the subject of American Journal of Epidemiology findings of a suggested cause and effect relationship. And they didn't find out until after Eileen Wellsome published her book or her articles in Albuquerque, when Tim Cornell of the Nashville Tennessean followed up on that and found this study at the library and wrote an article on the front page of the Tennessean. And in that article, there were descriptions from the published study of not the names, but the identification of the cancer victims by age, gender, type of cancer, and location of cancer. And so Emma Kraft, this is the part I can't get through without breaking up. I just, she's sitting at her chair and she gets her daily newspaper, the Nashville Tennessean, and she has spent the last, since 1958 when her child died, till 1993. So we're talking about 35 years she spent dealing with the act of God that took her child. And then she reads, "Oh my God, they're talking about my daughter who died because of the acts of man." And it just threw her back into an emotional tailspin that she had survived somehow when it first happened, as hard as it was to see her daughter go through 2.5 years of recurrent cancer and a gruesome death. She'd managed to live her life and be a loving mother to her other 3 daughters and a loving wife to the Reverend Kraft, who actually presided over Carolyn's funeral. And just Emma's story just resonated with me in a very deep way, and especially after I got to know her.
Yeah. Well, what makes you emotional about her and her story even now?
The purity of her spirit. Um, to me, beyond the science and the battles of experts, there was her statement that I guess I wouldn't sue them if they just apologize. And instead of apologizing, they did the opposite. They said, the records are lost. You can't even prove that you were exposed to radioactive iron. If you were exposed, it was a tracer dose that was too small to hurt anyone. And 3, the women, this is Dr. Darby talking wrongly, saying that the women were all told that they were being given this radioactive iron drink. None of that was true. What was true was that they had lost the records, but we were able to show, through a deposition of the lead scientist who wrote the study, that there was absolutely no chance that it was anyone else, because the type of cancer, the age, the gender, the rarity of such a cancer in a person of 8 years old, and the fact that there were only 800 women, the odds of having the identical cancer, identical age, identical location in that population is basically nil. And so she had to concede, even though Vanderbilt had said you can't prove it. She basically said, I'll say this, it's highly likely it's the same girl. And
Mm.
that's the legal standard of proof. So we were able to prove that to the legally required degree. And there's no doubt in anyone's mind that Carolyn, by the way, this is Carolyn.
Mm.
And Emma called her my little angel. And you can see why. I mean, she's just got an angelic radiance about her. And so what was it that moved me? It was Emma and her devotion. There's Emma with that same picture of Carolyn
Wow.
that she kept on her bureau for 35 years until, and then of course after as well. And, I mean, it's just the purity of her spirit and the depth of her loss were what moved me. And I was a new dad at the time. I mean, I became a dad during this case. And in fact, my wife and our oldest son, who's now 29, he was a year old at the time, and we visited with Emma in Nashville, and she was just a completely loving person who thought that children were God's greatest gift, and
Mm.
she took to our son right away, and she was a beautiful, beautiful person, and the kind of person that made me. I always want to do my best work, always. But the idea of doing it in this case for this person,
Mm.
I wanted to go to whatever limits I have,
Mm.
emotionally, intellectually, as a lawyer, everything.
Yeah, I feel that from you so deeply. Tell me more about what happened to Emma Kraft. Tell me more about the details of her case.
She got married when she was 16, and had her first daughter 9 months later. Her husband, her first husband, Floyd Busey, was a musician whom she met playing at barn dances in the neighborhood, and later went on to play on WSM, the country music station in Nashville, and she fell for the musician. And they were married young. Every 3 years, she had another daughter, all daughters. And she grew up in very plain circumstances on a little farm, taking care of her girls. Floyd, her husband, eventually became alcoholic and couldn't keep up with making the family work. And they were divorced. But he was still very loyal. They were divorced around the time that Carolyn became sick, which was around 1955, Christmas of 1955. Carolyn has a lump that the doctors described as the size of a grapefruit in her right thigh, and it had been obviously growing for many, maybe years by that time. I mean, she is 8 years old at the time, and this radioactive iron has been in her since she was in the womb. And one of the things that's important about, I was talking earlier about the experts and what we had to learn about it, was that an internal emitter, the risk of cancer from something that you ingest, depends on where it resides in the body. And in the case of radioactive iron, or iron generally, it goes to the blood-forming organs during fetal development. So it goes to the liver and the bone marrow, and then it settles there, and it has a half-life. And the half-life of there's 2 isotopes. One of them has a half-life of 47 days, and the other 2.5 years. So this radioactive iron that settles in her bone marrow is adjacent to where the cancer developed. And so that's part of what I had to learn about, is why is an internal emitter so much more dangerous than an X-ray that just passes through you? It's because it's there exposing tissue to radiation constantly for years. And so we don't know exactly when the cancer started, but it's conceivable it started in the womb with one wrong cell, one mutation.
What did Emma tell you that she remembered about those prenatal visits and when she was finally instructed to drink this radioactive cocktail?
We know that the protocol of the Tennessee Vanderbilt Nutrition Project was that the drink would be given at the second visit. For whoever was going to get it, that's when they would get it. And then for the remainder of their pregnancy, the scientists would take a blood sample. They wouldn't tell them why, but the reason was because it was radioactive, they could put it through a counter and see how much of the radiation was left. And by doing the basic math, they could figure out, well, this much is gone. The rest of it was absorbed into the mother. But they had no tests to determine how much was going into the fetus. They later did some estimates of that. The estimates are very questionable and not really relevant, because the epidemiology tells you what you need to know. There were cancers among the exposed, none in the unexposed. But
Did Emma think anything of being told to drink this in her second
no,
visit?
it's like you said earlier, they trust their doctors. And they were in Vanderbilt was the state of medical art in Nashville. And these are, average folks. They don't have any way to question it, and so they didn't.
Yeah, who was this group of women? Because unlike many of the other experiments that we've looked at, all of them were white. Is that correct?
They were all white, and that's because the facility was segregated.
Mm,
Nashville was part of the segregated South in that time. But they were all poor. The
mm.
reason they were going to this clinic was because they did not have the money for private care. And Vanderbilt, and I have to say, as I said at the outset, I think that the goals of the Tennessee Vanderbilt Nutrition Project were noble. And if it hadn't been for Paul Hahn, we wouldn't be having this conversation. The women who went to the Vanderbilt Clinic had the good fortune of receiving very high quality prenatal care for no or very little money. What happened along the way is that there was a rogue scientist whose name was Paul Hahn, who had been working with radioactive iron and other materials at other facilities at a time when there was a lot of interest in these new radioactive materials that were being made available at a very few centers around the country. And Paul Hahn presented the Tennessee Vanderbilt Nutrition Project with an idea to use radioactive iron to study the metabolism of iron and the needs for iron in pregnant women. While that sounds like a reasonable scientific experiment, there were many things wrong with the idea. One was that the information that he supposedly sought with radioactive iron was already available in the scientific literature by other means that did not involve risk. The other was that he personally, having worked with radioactive materials, should have known that there was risk, specifically risk to a developing fetus because of the high rate of development where one bad outcome in one cell quickly becomes multiplied by the fact that the fetus is developing. But as far as I can tell, he never disclosed that to the people who were running the project. Paul Hahn was not a doctor. He was a PhD scientist with a radiation science background. He was not a physician. The history of informed consent, yes, they should have been told even in the 1940s. We have a much more developed process for informed consent now, but even in the 1940s, it was required that these women should have been told what they were getting into. And as far as the risk, yes, there was all the way back to Marie Curie working with X-rays in the 1890s, it was known that radiation could cause cancer. In the 1920s, I think Eileen Wilson even talked with you about this, there were the radium dial painters who were using paint with radium to light up dials on clocks and watches and developing mouth cancer as a result.
So it comes down to this one rogue PhD, this rogue scientist, Dr. Hahn. So you don't believe that the state of Tennessee or the federal government knew necessarily or was involved in the radioactive aspect of that initial study, but Dr. Hahn goes and gets himself a government job in the 60s, and then the government very much is involved in the follow-up studies that continue.
There are two different periods of time where wrong was done. The 1945 to 1947 is when the administration of radioactive iron occurred. And that was the precipitating event that wound up causing an excess of childhood cancers among the children who were born of mothers who got the radioactive iron. And we can talk about that study. But the ironic and amazing thing to me that I learned during the case is that the same gentleman, Paul Hahn, and gentleman, I use the word loosely, he was a rogue, he was a hijacker. Hahn later wound up in a position with the United States Public Health Service. And in the 1960s, after there was something called the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission that came in the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the purpose of that was to study the effects of all gradations of radioactive exposure, from the most extreme close by to how far away you could be and still have impacts of the radiation, whether it would make you sick, whether it would make you get cancer. Out of this came the concept that there's really no safe dose of radiation, that some dose is going to cause harm to some people, and the greater the dose, the more likely you'll have risk of cancer. But it turned out that Paul Hahn was the person who instigated the follow-up study that found the cancers, because in his position with the U.S. Public Health Service, he was well aware by this time in the 1960s that there'd been quite a bit of study of the effects of radiation on developing fetus. Hahn was well aware of this developing science, and he went to his sources and said, there's a population that we should study. We could study these children who were exposed to radioactive iron 18 years ago and at Vanderbilt, and we can figure out whether there was any higher risk of cancer among the people who had the dose compared to a control group of women who just coincidentally did not have the radioactive iron because there wasn't any available when they were at the clinic. So when you talk about the government, the United States Public Health Service funded the follow-up study that was done on Emma Kraft and the other women to find out what had happened to their children. And the wrong that was done here wasn't to study them. It was studying them under false pretenses. And specifically there's a process called discovery that you may be familiar with, where in a lawsuit, you're entitled to ask the other side for relevant information, documents, depositions, interrogatories, anything you need to find the facts. It's the search for truth. And what we found was that some of our clients still had the letter that they'd received from the scientist who did the study.
And
They
what did
did
the
not
letter say?
they did not say, "We'd like to find out if any of your children had cancer."
Mm.
They said, "You may recall having taken part in a study of diet and eating habits," which was true, but it was false by omission because it didn't say, "You also got a radioactive iron dose, and we'd like to find out if your children have cancer." And they should have said that, and that was wrong. That resulted in the study being published in the American Journal of Epidemiology that said there had been 4 cancers in the children who had been exposed to radioactive iron in utero, compared to 0 in the control group, and concluded that those results suggested a cause and effect relationship.
Hmm.
The women were not told why the study was done, but
Okay.
Emma had no particular reason to be concerned. She said it didn't taste good, but she was told, and this was part of what the women who we represented told us, that it was called a cocktail. And when I got the chance to look at the records, a lot of the records were lost, but there were 1,500 pages of records from the Tennessee Vanderbilt Nutrition Project, and some of them described the protocols for this study. And one of them said, "At the second visit, we will give the cocktail." And when I saw that word, I said, 2 and 2 is 4. Our women are telling us the truth. That's what they called it. And then when I got to take Dr. Darby's deposition, he said that he never told the women there was radioactive iron in it, and he didn't know anyone who ever told the women. And so I knew that our client's story, not only did I believe it, but that it couldn't be questioned. It was the truth that I was looking for.
You described how the cancer began in Emma's daughter and the lump the size of a grapefruit on her leg. How did things progress?
Well, what happened was it was Christmas time, and this Emma gave this deposition of her own that was videotaped in case there's a process called a deposition to preserve testimony in case you don't live to the trial. Emma Kraft did one of those depositions where I asked her questions. She also had to face a grueling deposition from the other side that questioned everything she had to say and tried to come up with all kinds of other exposures that might have caused the cancer, like wood smoke or peanut butter or bananas. I mean, really crazy stuff, but she bore up under it well. But she described that her other daughters noticed the lump when Carolyn jumped off a staircase. She liked to jump. She was playful. She was just an average 8-year-old girl other than having this lump on her thigh. And they said, "Well, we've got to tell Mama." And Carolyn said, "I don't want to ruin Christmas." And so they didn't tell her till after Christmas. And then New Year's comes along and they tell her, and they take her
I
to
mean, what a surprising amount of self-awareness for an 8-year-old
she
to say something
from
like that.
everything that I could see, she was a very special child. She played
Mm.
piano, she sang, she was everybody's favorite.
Hmm.
And She liked to play school. She was always the teacher. Emma said that Carolyn, when she played school, she was the teacher.
Yeah.
And she just seemed like a kid who had a great future ahead of her.
Mm.
But so they went to Baptist Hospital, and there was a doctor named Elkin Rippey. And Dr. Rippey did surgery on Carolyn. And the gripping story that Emma tells about that is after the surgery, Dr. Rippey comes out and he says, "We got it all." That was
Wow.
what he thought.
Wow.
He thought that they had saved her life
Mm.
by getting all the cancer. And then Carolyn recovered from the surgery, and there was no recurrence for about a year. And then it came back. And so at that point, they tried what was considered a radical type of therapy that involved radiation. At the time, I mean, radiation is used to treat cancer in a much more sophisticated way currently and for many years since today. But at the time, there was an experimental radioactive cobalt machine that was used to treat the recurrence of the cancer. And Emma's testimony was that it made her skin look like burnt meat.
Mm.
And then it came back again, and I think there were 3 or 4 recurrences before the last one that she described as black cancer that had grown through her spine. She couldn't walk. She couldn't move.
Mm.
They had to pry her mouth open to get water into her mouth.
Mm.
And the pathos of it, Emma was a very religious person. And the way she looked at it until the very end was that if God can make you sick, God can heal you.
Mm.
And she prayed, and her husband, Floyd, even though they were separated, Floyd was very attentive to Carolyn, and they prayed a lot. And then when Carolyn died, Emma was just so distraught that she didn't know if she wanted to live or die. And so she testified that it took her about 3 years to get back to sort of being normal and not thinking about killing herself all the time.
Ugh.
And then Floyd Busey, her first husband, had moved on, and the Reverend Kraft, who presided over Carolyn's funeral, became Emma's second husband, and
Okay.
she stayed with him until he died, and then she died in 2005.
Mm. What was that moment like for her getting her paper, from her town, opening up that paper and seeing, oh my
The
God.
first thing that happened was that she fell on the floor. She basically
Wow.
fainted, and but when she came out of it, her instinct was, "I want some answers.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to find out." And the first thing she did was call Jim Sasser, who was her senator from Tennessee,
Mm.
and ask him to investigate. And Senator Sasser was very kind to her in person, but he had a mixed agenda, I would say.
Hmm.
Vanderbilt, I'll tell you a little anecdote about what George Barrett said the first time I spoke to him about this case. He had a folksy way of expressing himself. And what George said to me was that suing Vanderbilt in Nashville is like suing the Pope in Rome.
Mm. Wow.
And
Yeah, that puts it in perspective.
so Senator Sasser
Hmm.
had mixed loyalties, let's say. And the next thing that happened was that Emma was invited to a Senate hearing in Washington, D.C., and she'd never been on a plane before. In
Hmm.
fact, I met her at that hearing after she had
Wow.
testified. And it was painful to go to this hearing because she was really expecting something miraculous like the truth. And instead, She got a lot of the senators had left before her testimony even
Wow.
happened, and she got no answers out of that.
Hmm.
And this was at the same time she was asking for an apology. Didn't get the apology, didn't get answers, and she decided, "Yeah, I'll go forward with this lawsuit."
Wow. When you think back on Emma, what memory stands out to you most, and what do you want the public to understand about her?
She had this purity of spirit, where not only did she just want an apology, after she got the apology, she said, "I forgive them."
Wow.
She is an exemplary human being that I learned from, and that I feel like I had an opportunity to be my best self in representing her,
Hmm.
and that her consistent purity of purpose was like, uh, a guiding light in working on the case. So I would say what I want people to remember is that Emma stood up for truth. Emma was not interested. She didn't turn down the money, but it was never about the money for her. It was about the truth, and had getting the apology and then saying, "I'm sure Vanderbilt will never do an experiment like this again." She was an elevated. She was a plain spoken, elevated person.
I can see how passionate you still are about this, and I must imagine at that time, what was that like for you? You must just have been on fire. I mean, I'm sure there were sleepless nights for you going through this case.
There were many sleepless nights. I had to, I'm not a scientist by training. I did have a Bachelor of Science degree in psychology,
Okay.
but certainly radiation science was all new to me.
Mm.
I had a little bit of experience in toxic exposure from environmental cases, but having to learn about internal emitters and dosimetry, and having to learn about informed consent, and uh, having to meet these burdens of proof. And
But was this a slam dunk from the beginning?
oh no,
Or
oh no.
yeah, tell me more about that. What were some of the hurdles that you
Well,
faced?
here's one that shocked me, but I found a way to overcome it. The defense had hired an expert witness who was experienced on the defense side of radiation cases,
Hmm.
and he gave an opinion that Carolyn's cancer was caused by a prenatal X-ray. When I saw that, I was motivated. Again, I'm going to find the truth here, and so this was pre-Google. And I went to the Yellow Pages and I looked up doctors in Nashville, and I looked at Emma Kraft's medical records, and I found the name of Richard Cannon, who was her treating doctor during the pregnancy with Carolyn. And I called him up out of the blue and I said, Dr. Cannon, I introduced myself. He was affiliated with Vanderbilt, but he was emeritus and he was willing to talk to me. And
Wow.
I said, an expert on the other side has said that he thinks Carolyn had cancer because of an X-ray,
Hmm.
and I don't see any record of an X-ray in her file. And I'm just wondering if you'd be willing to talk with me about what your practice was in those cases. If there'd been an X-ray, would it be in your file?
Right.
And he said, yes. If there's no X-ray in the file, then I didn't take an X-ray. And I said, well, would you testify to that under oath? The next week, I was in a deposition getting him to say exactly that and comparing it to another patient of his who did have an X-ray, and it was in the file, and then saying,
Wow.
here's Carolyn and Emma, no X-ray. And he's saying probably wasn't an X-ray. And so that's part of the burden, is that there are experts who will make stuff up.
Mm.
And that's what I felt like this guy was doing. He was
Wow.
making something up about this imagined X-ray that would somehow explain away the radioactive iron as the cause of the cancer. And
Wow.
so, that's an example.
What was their position through this? What were they trying to say? How were they trying to defend themselves through this?
Well, I would say that Vanderbilt uh, ultimately did the right thing, but at the beginning, they were very willing to say, you can't prove it. You don't have the records. This met the ethical standards of the day, and they made us fight them on every one of those issues with convincing evidence from
Mm,
Harvard University, Emory University, Stanford, um, and so it was a real struggle. The radiation science community is fairly closed, and
mm,
it's highly funded by industry and the government.
mm, mhm.
So it was a struggle to find people who would testify from reputable institutions, who would testify on behalf of these women. And
At
so
any point, did you feel very confident that, like, "We've got this. This is going to go our way," or up until the very end, were you like, "We are trying our best here, but we just don't know?"
I felt, after I spoke with Richard Monson at Harvard University, and he read the epidemiology study, and he said, "It means what it says. There's a suggested cause and effect relationship here." I felt like once I had that, I didn't think it was a slam dunk, but I felt like I had enough to go to trial and that
Mm,
we had a very sympathetic case. But I also knew that I could not and would not settle it without the apology.
mm.
And I didn't know how that was going to go. But fortunately, uh, we were able to persuade, because we had done the homework, because we had the experts. The best way to settle a case is to be ready for trial and to prove to the other side that you're ready for trial, that you can come to court and convince a jury that your experts are honest, reputable, and right.
What was it like for that settlement to come down, and more importantly, that apology to come down?
Well, it was an amazing episode in my life. Again, a very emotional moment. The way this works is that there were only uh, 4 people who knew that the apology was coming. Well, my co-counsel, George Barrett, knew. My wife, Jill, knew because I told her that's what was going to happen. The judge knew.
Mm,
And Alfred Wilcox on the defense side knew. So there were a handful of us who knew, and Emma Kraft knew because we told her, "We're not going to settle this without the apology, and here it is. This is what is going to happen." And we insisted it's got to be a real apology, not
mhm.
just "I'm sorry if" or some stuff like that. And so what happened was, the reason we couldn't tell the whole world about it is that an apology is an admission of wrongdoing. And so to settle a class action, you have to have the participation of all or nearly all of the class members. The last thing that Vanderbilt would want to do is admit wrongdoing and thereby concede a large part of the case to a large number of people who would then opt out and sue them, saying, "Summary judgment, they've already admitted wrongdoing." So we went to court, knowing that as part of the settlement approval process, this apology would be given, and the courtroom for the settlement hearing was filled with women in their 70s and 80s and their children who were in their 40s and 50s, just packed. And they
Women who
don't
had
know.
all been experimented on, who were all
Right,
from this study. Wow.
right. And they didn't know what was coming. They did not know the apology was coming. So Wilcox, the attorney for uh, the other side, for Vanderbilt in particular, starts to read the apology from Vanderbilt, and the judge tells him to turn that podium around.
Mm.
That if don't face me, face those women and their
Ugh, I
children.
just got chills. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Me too. And then he reads the apology, and it's like everybody's crying. Everybody's crying. No one expected that. In the history of litigation, I've been doing this since 1979, 46 years now. It's the only time I've ever seen it or had the ability to experience it. At one point, we tried to get we were going to ask the judge to order Vanderbilt to apologize before we got them to do it voluntarily. And
Mm.
I couldn't find a single precedent I couldn't find a single case where somebody had been ordered to apologize in the history of litigation. And so it wasn't just surprising to me, it was surprising to everyone. My wife was crying, I was crying, and then Emma goes out on the courthouse steps and says, uh, "I forgive them."
Ugh.
And so it was, an
Ugh.
amazing, amazing experience, a case of a lifetime. I've been in a lot of really important big cases, but this one to me is like where it just touches my heart continuously.
Yeah. I what a remarkable thing for her to be able to say that she forgave them after the way you described Carolyn's illness and death. I cannot imagine what she went through. What did Emma tell you personally that apology meant to her? What was the aftermath of that case like for her?
Well, I've saved some of the letters Emma wrote to me, um, where she says that she felt like I was family.
Mhm.
It's very deep for me, um, because I put everything I could into it for her, and like I said, we wouldn't settle it without the apology, and we didn't know if we'd get it, and we had to wait until trial was near, and we had already finished with all the expert witnesses, and I had to be uh, very persistent with the other side that the money's good, but no settlement without the apology.
Yeah, and what was the money? What was the
Okay, so
monetary
this is,
settlement?
the money was about $10.3 million.
For how many plaintiffs?
Well, there was only one Emma Kraft, um, and she got 1.5 million, and the other 9 million or so was spread around for civil rights violations, for about 300 people who came forward. A lot of the women had died or hadn't known about it.
Mm,
So there were several hundred, and they got reasonable amounts. They got more than anyone else for radiation experiments.
yeah,
And the reason that they got a lot less is because our experts told us that despite their complaining that they were born premature or they couldn't eat vegetables or whatever complaints they had medically, they were not related to having had
mm,
radioactive iron. They did have a claim for their civil rights being violated,
mhm,
and so they were entitled to compensation, and the compensation we got them was more than received in other radiation experiments.
mhm,
So we
mhm,
felt like, and not only did we feel like, to get the settlement approved, we had to tell the judge why it was fair, reasonable, and adequate. That's the standard for approving a settlement, and he thought it was. And
mhm,
so we felt like we did our job. The other reason to take, obviously, if you win a case like that at trial, the number that you could reach could be enormous, but it would be appealed forever. And these women were in their 70s and 80s already.
yeah, yeah,
I'd,
yeah,
I've I've been in cases that take 20 years to resolve. I worked on
yeah,
the Exxon Valdez. That
mm,
happened in 1989 and didn't resolve until 2009.
yeah, yeah,
So you have to take into account the age of the plaintiffs. Always have to respect the other side, and the risk that you have in going to trial. Um, and you have to acknowledge that what you really wanted was the apology, and you weren't going to get that from a trial. You had to
yeah,
get it through them seeing the light, and they saw the light.
yeah,
So I give Vanderbilt credit at the very beginning for starting a good program for poor women to have good health care, and
mm.
at the very end for doing the right thing by apologizing.
Did was Dr. Hahn still alive at this
No, no,
time?
and
Mm.
ironically, he died of cancer.
Oh, another one of the women, Helen Hutchinson, around 20 years old at the time of the experiment, and she was urged by her doctor, drink it all, drink it on down. Later, she described hair loss, blisters, miscarriage, her daughter's cancer. When you hear her story, what struck you the most about her?
I think she was honest and forthright and upset, and so was her daughter, Barbara. Um, and I had great respect for what they'd been through. Our experts could not prove that their conditions had anything to do with having been given radioactive iron. So it put me in this difficult place of having to explain that while my sympathies were certainly with them for having been subjected to this violation of their bodily integrity, which is what the law calls this, or a battery, where you are given a drink that you don't consent to. As a lawyer, I could not convince a jury. I wouldn't even get past the judge. The judge would dismiss it before it gets to a jury if I tried to say that hair loss and blisters were due to radioactive iron, or that, Barbara Hutchinson had skin cancer, which, no, I'm not laughing about that. That's very serious and can be fatal. But a lot of people get skin cancer, and the idea that I could show that having been exposed to radioactive iron in utero was related to skin cancer 25 or 34 years later, it's not going to happen. It's just not possible. And so this is part of my search for truth, is not to push it beyond what's true.
I mean, looking at those facts, it's kind of a miracle that you were able to find that settlement with Emma Kraft, because so many decades had gone by. Records are claimed to be missing. You have expert witnesses in a pretty closed community who are willing to come forward and say all kinds of things. Looking back on it, can you believe that you did it?
I've looked back at it enough to believe that I did it. They made it expensive for us by requiring that we have all these experts.
Mm,
I think when I had the most sleep loss, as you were asking earlier about it and whether we would win or lose, was in being turned down by experts, not because we were wrong on the science, but because they were on the other side. They were part of the establishment that uh, had worked for the defense in radiation exposure cases, and
mm.
that were not uh, inclined by disposition or background to help me. And so,
Regardless of the truth.
regardless of the truth, exactly. And uh, when I discovered Richard Monson at Harvard, and he said, "I can help." It was like the excitement was palpable. And he in turn led me to the radiation biologist at Harvard, who helped me with the internal
Wow.
dosimetry, and um, and finding David Rothman, brave souls who were willing to speak truth to power, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. Was it hard for you to not be able to help all of the women, to not be able to help women like Helen?
Um, I don't look at it that way. I feel like I did help them. I
Mm,
helped them to the limits of truth, and I felt like the apology wasn't just to Emma. Emma was the one who had the power to insist on it because she had the most serious claim. But the apology was to all the women who'd been exposed without their knowledge or consent.
mhm, mhm.
It was so that to me was across the board. Everyone in that experiment benefited from closure. In fact, there was one of the class members was a reverend. His name was Ron Hamm, Hamm, and he spoke at the settlement hearing. And one of the things he said was that this is a wonderful way to resolve this case, where nothing that has been hidden shall not be brought to light.
Mm, mm,
And he quoted scripture to say it, and I felt like his contribution at that settlement hearing was so appropriate to uh, how I felt about it. That I mean, they all got money. Barbara and Helen got more money than others because they got, in addition to the regular settlements, they were class representatives, so they got extra for taking on the burden of the litigation. Um, it wasn't nearly as substantial as what Emma got, but they were alive. Carolyn was not, and so we did our homework on the settlement valuation. The judge agreed with us that we got it right, and we got the apology across the board.
In your opinion, should the government and not just Vanderbilt have been held accountable in court for this?
Um, that's a good question. I think that the only damages that we talked about the United States Public Health Service funding this follow-up study. Um, I think that they should have disclosed the accurate information about why they were doing the study, and they should have told the women what they found. The only damages that would have accrued from that would be emotional distress, because the U.S. government and the state of Tennessee were the U.S. government not at all, and the state of Tennessee only marginally involved in giving the radioactive iron. It was the radioactive iron that caused the harm. So I think that the parties that caused the harm are the parties that paid, and then taking on an emotional distress case based on those facts would have been more costly than it would have been worth to do it.
Did the government do anything wrong here?
Uh, like I said, the government should not have funded a follow-up study without telling these people why they were being followed, and then sharing with them the results in 1967 so that they didn't have to wait till 1993 to find out what had happened.
What was the most infuriating argument that Vanderbilt made to try to shirk accountability here?
Well, the one that I said about the fake X-ray that never
Mm.
happened, that was very infuriating because he just made it about a whole cloth. The second one that I can think of is that even though Vanderbilt's own professors and scientists wrote the follow-up study that said there was a suggested cause and effect relationship, they hired experts to say that their previous experts got it wrong, and that the leukemia shouldn't have been counted with the solid cancers, and that the synovial sarcoma that Carolyn had was not really radiation-induced, even though
So they're disputing their own findings.
we're
I mean,
disputing.
and also, I mean, what a giant flag for them to wave about this experimentation and what they did. I mean, they published their study results.
They did, and then they didn't tell anybody. They didn't tell the people who had
No, they
harm.
didn't tell the subjects. Yeah,
Uh,
but they published it.
and the third one was trying to pretend that that Emma couldn't prove that Carolyn was exposed because the records had been lost. They're the ones that lost the records, and they put us through all our paces to show that, yeah, it was the same girl. But those are the big three.
Wow. Is this settlement closure, or is there any unfinished justice for these women, for these families, and for the other people, the other Americans who were experimented on during this era?
I can't speak to those other experiments. I know that others in my firm worked on the Cincinnati case. I think that as far as the Vanderbilt case, yes, it's closed. We got as much as we could, and the apology, and we did the best we could for them.
How do you look back on this period of time?
Well, I'm still in it to the degree that I'm still working on the opioids case, and I'm still working on the social media litigation, and I'm still, there are always people who are going to be trying to profit from things that are causing harm to others.
Mm.
And I look back at this as sort of a peak experience of practice of law because of the person I was representing and the difficulties that were presented and the result that we got. In particular, getting the apology was only made possible because of 4 years of hard work, insight, and dedication, to all because of, well, partly because that's who I am, but largely because of who I was doing it for.
Mm.
So I look back at it as not completely different from everything else that I do, but maybe the highest peak of my 45 years as a lawyer.
I feel we are all so fortunate that you've done this work and continue to do this work. Attorney Donald Arbitblit, thank you so much for your time.
Appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for listening and watching. This podcast was put together by Ryan Kerr, Mia Balbin-Cuesta, Ali Purser, and me, Natasha Zouves. And a quick reminder, you can listen to The Truth of the Matter with Natasha Zouves wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time.